Hi folks, and welcome to our video lesson on Soviet montage theory. This is going to be an overview of some of the basic context, some of the basic concepts, and some ways to think about Soviet montage theory with respect to the other theories we looked at in class. First, a couple of pointers. Most of you probably know this, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page. When I say montage, that comes from the French word montage, and the verb monter, which means to assemble. This doesn't refer to montage sequences as we mean them in film studies, especially as influenced by classical continuity, where a montage sequence is a kind of sequence that compresses space and time and often summarizes an idea or a certain kind of action and its multiple iterations over time, like a training montage. So with that out of the way, I want to break down this lesson into three basic components. The first is constructivism and what that means. The second is thinking about cinema as language. The third is thinking about editing and meaning. So let's look at constructivism. First, a bit of background to get us to Russian or Soviet constructivism, a modernist art movement in the 19-teens and 20s.
Director Sergei Eisenstein was a pioneer of film theory, particularly the theory of montage. But to really understand Eisenstein's impact on cinema, we first need to understand the history of editing up until 1925 and the state of Soviet filmmaking after the revolution in 1917. By 1925, filmmakers had already developed the basic film editing techniques required to tell a cohesive story. The major idea of both American and European filmmaking was continuity editing, where a filmmaker tries to make the film match reality in a natural way, creating an immersive experience for the viewer in a way that disguises the actual process of filmmaking. Filmmakers were using techniques like cutting on action, where the director makes a cut to correspond with an action on the screen, matching eye level, cutting from someone's eyes to what they're looking at, and cross-cutting, cutting back and forth between two pieces of action happening at the same time. These techniques help to build a realistic environment with easy-to-understand action. Over in Russia, communist revolutionary Vladimir Lenin was a big believer in the power of film. He said, "For us, of all the arts, cinema is the most important." And after the Russian Revolution in 1917, one of the primary goals of the new government was to consolidate power and to spread information. To do this, Russia nationalized the production of films and created what would become known as the Moscow Film School. After the revolution, film stock was in short supply, so instead of feature films, Soviet filmmakers focused on making short films for the purpose of propaganda and agitation, called agitprop. Rather than producing feature films, the students of the Moscow Film School focused on developing the theory of film. They took imported films like Intolerance and Birth of a Nation to study, making hundreds of re-edits, moving the order of frames, shots, and scenes into hundreds of possible combinations, studying how the new orders changed the film's meaning and emotional impact.
Okay, so I kind of want to pick up where this video essayist left off. The Moscow Film School confronted this problem. There was no raw film stock in the Soviet Union, or at least a very short supply, and so there was this ambition by the Soviet filmmakers and Soviet film thinkers to look closely at the way film is constructed before they were to make their own films. This is incredibly interesting if you think about your own role as film students, both thinking of yourselves as filmmakers, but also people who look at films in order to break them down and to dissect them, and how the two things are mutually inclusive in your education. But I want to think about how this is related to a broader artistic movement happening in the Soviet Union and with respect to this idea of constructivism. So look at Kuleshov and how he thinks about this. He says, "It became apparent to us that American films were best in terms of their influence on the viewer. We began to analyze not only the separate shots of a film, but studied its entire construction." Now, this idea of construction and constructivism is very, very important. So I just want to kind of summarize what constructivism is. It's an art movement that you can see in design, that is kind of two-dimensional illustration, in architecture and in painting and in theater and, of course, in film. The way Wikipedia defines constructivism is as a movement that rejected decorative stylization in favor of the industrial assemblage of materials. Again, this idea of industrial assemblage. Another way of building on this definition is to say that in place of painterly concerns with composition, constructivists were interested in construction. Rather than emerging from an expressive impulse or an academic tradition, art was to be built. So I hope you can begin to see the way in which the major concerns of the Soviet montage theorists, that is what Kuleshov thought and what Eisenstein thought, does revolve around this idea of looking at film with an emphasis on its pieces, on its units, and how those units are rearranged, juxtaposed to create something new. And there's many ways you can think of this metaphorically with respect to a world after the revolution. How do we take a system, break it down, and then reassemble its pieces into something new? This is incredibly important for the Bolshevik Revolution. So here's a couple pieces of constructivist art. This illustration titled "Oppressed Peoples of the World, of the Whole World." You can see the way in which the illustration is clearly made up of discrete pieces. It almost has a collage effect, right? The design elements remind us of those clean geometric lines and shapes of modernism and of cubism, but it's important to note the discreteness of each element. You can see that discreteness of each element in the most famous constructivist work, which is a design for a building that was never actually built. This is Totland's Tower, conceived of in 1919. What's important is that you can see all of the pieces of the tower. It is in some sense transparent to the eye. It's not concealing its construction, it is wearing its own construction on its sleeve. It's an aesthetic of assemblage. So think about this quote from Kuleshov in that context. He says, "We became convinced that the fundamental source of the film's impact on the viewer, a source present only in cinema, was not simply to show the content of certain shots, but the organization of those shots among themselves." So I want you to think about this idea when you read Kuleshov's writing. So one of Kuleshov's main ideas is often called creative geography, and it's a concept that you're very, very familiar with. And in fact, it's important that when Kuleshov is theorizing editing, or the possible effects of editing, he's not inventing anything. He's actually looking at the way things have been created for the last, say, 25 years, and he comes up with theorizations, conceptualizations of what's already been done. So one of the most basic ideas is what he calls creative geography, which he talks about in this one example. He says, "We film them, edit the film, and the result is that they are seen walking up the steps of the White House, even though these people were never actually at, quote unquote, the White House." So you can see that kind of idea in something as old as an 1899 early cinematic film, Kiss in the Tunnel. So Kuleshov is interested in this cognitive faculty that happens when we see the viewpoint of a train moving forward. We cut to an interior space, clearly is not an actual train, but our mind puts these two things together as, say, being contiguous, right? We intuit the idea that, oh, we saw the front view of a train, and the subsequent shot is the interior of that train. And we see this all the time throughout the history of film, but it's really the avant-gardists who take this principle and show the seams. So an avant-garde film like Le Chien on the Louvre from 1929 is going to use this principle, but it's going to make you see the principle in action. So when the woman shuts the door, we get a close-up, and then of course the reverse shot is a new location. And she is suddenly on the beach. It's giving the illusion of contiguity, though there is no contiguity. Or another avant-gardist from the film that was assigned as a kind of short film to think with Eisenstein, A Movie by Bruce Conner, right? Even more importantly, Bruce Conner, like the Soviets, in the early part of the Moscow Film School, is working with found footage. None of this footage is something that he shot, but he creates new meanings. When the sailor looks through the periscope, he is seeing not the contents of the ocean, but a kind of pinup model, someone from an erotic film, and then he reacts, and then we get this idea. And actually the film will kind of play with this as kind of inspiring the motivation of the next subsequent shots, as being kind of erotically charged. Looking again at Kuleshov's writing, he'll say about this technique, he says, you can splice the face of Alexandra with the body of Nata, and again, this will not be through trick photography, but montage. That is, by the organization of the material rather than by a technical gimmick. And I think Kuleshov is revealing something important about his values here. It seems important for Kuleshov that this technique is not a gimmick, and it's not, say, manipulating the footage. It seems important that Kuleshov is not doing something like slow motion or fast motion or reverse motion, things that actually change the nature of the footage. He's respecting the footage but creating new meanings by changing the relationship between bits of footage. That is the organization of the material. And he kind of furthers this idea when he says, with montage, it becomes possible both to break down and to reconstruct, and ultimately to remake the material. This is a deeply constructivist idea, and you can almost see the ideology of a revolution wrapped up in this, to break down the stuff of the world and to reconstruct the stuff of the world in order to remake the material or remake a new kind of system. So now let's look at cinema as language. The little prologue to Kuleshov's excerpt that I assigned talks about him this way. Kuleshov was the first filmmaker who began to talk about an alphabet, an organization of inarticulate material, and who worked with syllables, not words. It would be very useful for us to think about the constant invocation of language as a metaphor to think with when theorizing the possibilities of film. And one way to think about this invocation of language is to suggest that we're moving beyond thinking about the organization of space and time that we got with, say, D.W. Griffith and the emergence of continuity editing, and we're starting to think about shots as chains in a signifying link that can produce new kinds of meaning. Kuleshov was interested in the organization of space and time, as of course was someone like Munsterberg, but Kuleshov's other work is going to push into the Eisenstein emphasis on constructing new kinds of meaning, which I think is quite and importantly different. So once again, we're moving from continuity editing's emphasis on space and time to Soviet Montage's interest in the construction of new ideas or new meanings. So the Kuleshov effect is a good example of a way of taking Kuleshov into the realm of constructing meaning. So let's look at what he says about this experiment in his own writing. He says, we had an argument about whether the particular psychological state of an actor experiences is dependent or not on montage. The montage was so edited that we involuntarily imbued a serious face with a changed expression characteristic of that playful moment. It became apparent that it was possible to change the actor's work, his movements, his very behavior in either one direction or another through montage. So the first thing I hope that you pick up on is this idea of expression, which we talked about in our previous weeks with Balash and Epstein. We have an almost contradictory opposite theory of expression that has to do not with what can magically occur when you translate an ordinary person's face into the space of a cinematic screen, but that it comes from the juxtaposition of shots. This is incredibly important to kind of think about the tension between these different film theorists writing in the 1920s. But what's equally important is to think about the emergence of this kind of A plus B equals C emphasis on signification, right? So famously, the way Kuleshov effect is often understood is you get a juxtaposition of singularly signifying images. A face plus soup equals a new thing, that is hunger, or a face plus a dead child equals a new thing, that is sadness. Meaning is created out of juxtaposition rather than being contained within an individual shot. And there's almost a way in which Kuleshov wants to relate this to the way individual words constructed in a string of signification in a sentence can yield new and more complex meanings. As a kind of thought experiment with the Kuleshov effect, I might ask you to play with at home. Just think about the way in which this works and the way you've seen the Kuleshov effect in different films. So I'll take a few examples from the films we've watched. Look at this face right here. Ask yourself, how does it signify? And then ask yourself if that signification changes when it's embedded within this context.
Elle l'accueille simplement. Elle l'appelle son spectre. Un jour, elle semble avoir peur. Un jour, elle se penche sur lui. Un jour...
So the question I might pose to you is your analysis of the facial signification or the emotion being expressed in the image, does it change when you get a verbal Kuleshov effect, that is the voiceover telling you what she's experiencing? Does that change the way you read her facial expression? And the third thing I might ask you to think about is to re-examine our probably most Kuleshovian film in the sense of Kuleshov effect, which was Arrival, a film that plays on the ability for context to change the way in which we read the emotional expressions of a character. Okay, let's go back to that idea of montage as language and think about how Eisenstein thinks about it. He says in a different essay that I'm going to talk about a little bit in this presentation, he'll say, now why should the cinema follow the forms of theater and painting rather than the methodology of language, which allows wholly new concepts or ideas to arise from the combination of two concrete denotations of two concrete objects? This should remind you of this important bit from the essay that we read, the cinematographic principle. He writes, for example, the picture for water and the picture of an eye signifies to weep. The picture of an ear nearing the drawing of a dog means to listen. A dog plus a mouth is to bark. A mouth plus a child is to scream, and so on. And then he reminds us of the point of this metaphor, that this is montage. Once again, to think about this as the yielding of a conceptual meaning from two importantly concrete denotations. It's important to remember that film is a medium that restricts itself to the representation of concrete things. A camera can only film that which is concrete. Eisenstein is excited about this idea of taking two concrete things, juxtaposing them, and creating a new conceptual thing. So he'll say this exact thing later in the essay. He says the point is that the copulation of two hieroglyphs of the simplest series, perhaps we should say combination, is to be regarded not as their sum, but as their product. That is, as a value of another dimension, another degree. Each separately corresponds to an object, to a fact, but their combination corresponds to a concept. The idea that just as in certain forms of language, you can create conceptual ideas by yoking together two concrete nouns or things in the world, perhaps Eisenstein says cinema can do the same thing, especially given that cinema has at its disposal the representation or the filming of any concrete object or surface in the world. So we might say that Eisenstein is blown away by what language can do. Now, if we remember from our previous weeks, this very much goes against our thinkers Epstein and Balash, for whom cinema liberates us from language and gets us beyond its constraints. This is not a quote from either of them. This is just me quoting them as if they were to kind of summarize their ideas. My question for you, as a way of thinking through this tension, is how is it that this thing called language can be so differently treated by two kinds of film theorists that equally celebrate the uniqueness of film as a medium for, say, changing our relationship to reality? In other words, how do Balash and Epstein conceive language, and how does Eisenstein and Kuleshov conceive language? That's a question for you to think about.